On Saturday, November 9th, you can watch a live Notebook on Cities and Culture conversation at the New Urbanism Film Festival at Los Angeles' Acme Theater. The festival, which runs from November 7th to the 10th, moves the conversation about urban planning out of the textbook, beyond the council chambers, and into the movie theater. For more details on the full schedule, visit newurbanismfilmfestival.com. Season 4 of Notebook on Cities and Culture is brought to you by Daniel Murphy, Polar Inertia, a journal of nomadic and popular culture, online at polarinertia.com, and Medivate, a community and set of tools to help you build the kind of meditation practice you'd like to have, online at medivate.com. Seeing Los Angeles in this unusual way we see it today, where not at the moment, but earlier, it was raining. How does the look and feel, how does the aesthetic of this place change when the rain is coming down for you?
Oh, wow. Whenever the rains come down in Los Angeles, I kind of remember the Philippines. Because in the Philippines, we only have, 2 seasons. Wet season, dry season. So whenever it rains, I kind of, remember going back home and seeing that in Los Angeles kind of juxtaposed together is kind of cool.
It is Notebook on Cities and Culture. I'm Colin Marshall, sitting down today in North Hollywood with Carren Jao, who writes on art, design, and architecture here in Los Angeles and in Manila. She's based in both cities. You may have read her writing in venues like, Dwell Asia, Surface Asia, the Los Angeles Times, KCET, Makeshift, the Architect's Newspaper, all kinds of places. What am I missing? People should really know about there. What places do you think you're most excited to be writing for right now?
Wow. Well, right now, KCET is very exciting because I'm covering the Los Angeles River. There's a lot of excitement around the 52 mile river right now. Architectural Record has been kind of really cool. It's given me a bigger audience in terms of just what's happening in Los Angeles. And of course, the Los Angeles Times, they have done an amazing job having me cover a lot of local makers. So that's pretty exciting to have an excuse to just go talk to these people whose products you always see on the shelves and kind of give a background or a story to what they do.
The Los Angeles River is a river some people from outside here don't know exists, that there is a river in Los Angeles, but it's important in Los Angeles' history, and I've read your writing about it. And it's... What role would you say the Los Angeles River plays right now in this city?
I think the Los Angeles River is kind of that connection that people don't realize they have to each other. Los Angeles is such a big kind of city. You wouldn't really think about how does the San Fernando Valley connect to the Long Beach? But really looking through the path of the Los Angeles River, that's how we all are part of the same area. It kind of establishes a common bond between different Angelinos, even from different neighborhoods. And what's fascinating about it is because it's water, it's just, you can't really control it. You can't put borders in it. So even though you'd say, oh, this is, this city's problem, it's not really. It's kind of everybody's problem. And what I like about it is it brings people together.
And this idea of controlling water, that's why it looks the way it does now, isn't it? You see it in, I think most evocatively, the Alex Cox movie Repo Man. When they drive through, there's a chase through the Los Angeles River. And from that perspective, it looks just like a concrete ditch, sort of. But it looks better now. But there's so much talk. This seems like it's huge among architecture and design people in Los Angeles. What are we going to do with the river? Isn't it?
That's true. A lot of the things that I found most exciting is having architecture and landscape people kind of see the river and reimagine it into something that could be a new green space for Los Angeles. One of the things that was surprisingly very, very exciting for people in Los Angeles was a new campaign by the Los Angeles River Revitalization Corporation, and they're calling it Greenway 2020, but it's basically connecting all 51 miles of the Los Angeles River in one big greenway. And when you think about having a river that's kind of almost disappeared in the city and having it revived into a green space that's an amenity for people all around the neighborhood. That's pretty exciting to be able to, go into one part of the river and then go all the way down and see all different neighborhoods along the way. I think that for me is pretty cool.
We mentioned off mic before that the regular flooding of Los Angeles that happened when the river sort of had its more natural way before, and we mentioned the flooding that happens in the Philippines. What is in common between those floodings?
I think both cities still have, that kind of shock when it happens. It's like, oh my goodness, it's flooding, or what are we going to do? But in one way, Los Angeles is more progressive, which we had talked about before. Los Angeles at least knows that it has to do something about the flooding, and it has to be able to kind of at least slow the water down and make sure that they're able to reuse the water. In the Philippines, it's a little bit more problematic because they're going through this period of understanding that they have a problem, but they're not at the point yet of fixing the problem. There have been some small campaigns to ask what are resilient designs that we could implement along the waterway or along flooding areas, but no real implementation yet. And that takes political will. That takes the support of the government, which in Los Angeles they actually do. There's a lot of excitement about making sure that our water is used efficiently and that there's a lot of green space amenities for Angelinos. But in the Philippines, it's still more of a grassroots thing. They're still getting to that point that, all right, we need to do something now. Despite a lot of disastrous flooding that takes hours and hours, and people get stuck in floods for 3 hours minimum.
Now, growing up in Manila, what impressions did you get of what kind of a city it was? What made you interested in the shape, the form Manila had?
Wow. Manila is very organic. I think a lot of it is really, if you look at it piece by piece, it's the way it is because of the way people have made it. And if you know anything, in the Philippines, a lot of how everything works is kind of shooting from the hip, kind of.
It's improvisational, yes.
It's improvisational. So we kind of make do with what we have. So if the streets, there are hardly any gridded streets. It's mostly curvy. There's little nooks and crannies, even traffic signals. A lot of my friends kind of joke we had friends from the U.S. to come visit us. There's not a lot of traffic signals, but there's definitely a lot of ways around the traffic that people try to get from point A to point B. So I look at the Philippines as kind of an exciting place, or at least Manila as an exciting place, where really you could do what you wanted to do and get away with it. And that could be a good thing or a bad thing.
I'm reminded of an interview I did with some architects, Juan Carlos Cano and Paloma Vera in Mexico City a few months ago on their show. And they were saying, the systems in Mexico City, the garbage collection, how could this possibly work? Nothing seems like it should work, yet everything sort of works. Is it the same in Manila?
Very much so. I guess because we aren't given a lot of, in terms of top down, we tend to make it ourselves from the bottom up. Which is why I guess I was attracted to writing for Makeshift. They had the same aesthetic in terms of making do with what you had and making it something better. Or if you don't have that amenity or that resource, you have to make it for yourself. Because I see a lot of that in the Philippines.
Listeners might not know Makeshift Magazine, so what is their mission?
Makeshift is actually trying to put design not in a high design context, but more in if you need it, you make it for yourself. It's a little akin to DIY, but a lot of the innovations you'd see are from places like India, the Philippines, or Africa. Very much in places where there aren't a lot of resources, and you tend to make the best out of it and maybe make an even better solution that's appropriate for the area. Because a lot of the things that, for example, for the U.S., a lot of the innovations that we come up with are still very centered on having functioning systems. But in other countries, you find that systems aren't always the same. So a lot of it is very place appropriate, I would say.
You mentioned showing American friends around Manila, and they notice the traffic light differences or the differences in the way traffic operates. What else do foreign friends that you're showing Manila react to? Like, what really strikes them or seems to strike them as unusual? Like, wow, this is not like wherever I came from, that isn't the Philippines.
One of the biggest things that they probably react to is just the sheer amount of people there are. There's, I think, about 12 million people in the city, but it's definitely not as large as Los Angeles. So even, like, we are sitting in a cafe in North Hollywood, and there's maybe like 2 people on the sidewalk. In the Philippines, you'd probably get a whole ant line already. So
the procession never stops down the sidewalk.
Basically, there's a lot of activity. So when I first moved to the U.S., I was wondering, like, where is everybody?
Right. It's like common. Well, they're driving past us right now. There they are. This ant line doesn't stop.
There you go. That is a different ant line. In the Philippines, it does stop.
Going is the exception, from what I understand. In some parts of Manila, where it's just like cars are bumper to bumper, and you might get through, you might not.
Yes, that's true. So just dealing with the amount of people is something that's quite shocking for people. How do you get from point A to point B without having to see your end goal? The other thing is, I guess, the hospitality of people. We had talked a little bit about this too, how people are so accommodating. Like in the Philippines, if there is a way they can make your life easier, if you are their guest, they would definitely do it.
What was your transition? What was your journey from the Philippines to Los Angeles? Were you straight over from Manila to here, or how did that work?
That was interesting. So I grew up in the Philippines. I spent summers in Orange County when I was a kid. And then I basically spent most of my time in the Philippines until I took up grad studies. And I took up grad studies deliberately in like the farthest place in the U.S. that I had never been to, which is upstate New York. I figured it would be a nice educational experience for me to figure out what it's like to be in the U.S., but not in the U.S. everybody kind of knows.
You were really saying, where were all the people there, right?
Yes, there you go. And then from grad school, I moved to Los Angeles with my husband.
Tell me what your reactions were. I want to turn the concept around we've been talking about. What were your reactions when you came here? What seemed especially different about Los Angeles since you had gotten used to first Manila and then upstate New York?
What's different about Los Angeles? I guess just a little bit of the culture. I think Los Angeles kind of felt like a strange mix of all the different places I've been. There's definitely a huge Asian influence here, which is unexpected for me. I also didn't expect to see a lot of like the Latin American influence, which is kind of akin to my experience in the Philippines, which has been like a Spanish colony for like 300 years.
Right. The parts I think of as the main parts of Los Angeles are the Asians and the Latin Americans. That's like what this city is to me.
Yeah, exactly. So in a way, coming to Los Angeles was a little bit like coming home, but not exactly. So for me, that was fascinating how things can be the same, but also different.
Writing about the art, the design, the architecture here, I mean, when you got here, where did you look first for what you should be interested in? Or how in such a big space did you figure out where to look, where to begin looking?
I think I started out from what my interests were. Ever since I was young, I really enjoyed taking public transportation. I think it was kind of like being in an amusement park and having a free ride. So I really love that concept that I could get around without having to have a car. Although I do have a car, but the fact that there's an option not to, I love that. So one of the first things I covered actually here was design D-Lab's car-free event in the Jewel Box downtown, which is now like the Gensler offices. So they challenged all of Los Angeles to go to this event without taking a car. And that for me was fascinating, and I think it says a lot about where Los Angeles was at the time, when it's kind of starting to figure out that, hey, we didn't really need cars to get around. So that's how it started. And from there, I think we just kind of expanded. I just kept on looking for things that were interest to me, but also spoke a little bit about what Los Angeles was.
Now, how would you describe the transit situation in Manila? What's it like these days?
We are building our transit situation.
Exactly what you would say about Los Angeles, right?
That's true. Although I would say...
We don't have jeepneys here, though. We need some jeepneys.
That's true. Jeepneys are kind of a fun experience, which is also one of the things we took our friends to do. Strangely enough, they really wanted to try it.
Well, you hear so much about jeepneys. From when you read about the Philippines, it's like, I gotta ride a jeepney, even if it's terrible, I gotta ride it.
I was so surprised, really. I think when I first heard that our friends wanted to take the jeepneys, I was like, really? You wanted to take the jeepneys?
For the listeners who don't know, these are what converted American jeeps that get turned into, of a sort, taxis?
Yes, basically they're kind of like that. They're communal in that sense. They're open airs, so you get into them, you pay a simple fare, and then you get out. The difference between that is, like, unlike buses, they don't have they do have stops, but we're very accommodating in the sense that if you say stop here, right at this intersection, they will stop for you.
There's little green buses in Mexico City that do that exact same thing. If someone wants off, they stop. If someone wants on, they get on. It sounds like the same principle.
Yes. I don't know if it's going to be as organized, because in the jeepneys it's very, I'm going to stop here. All right, we'll stop here.
Jeepneys aside, I mean, some people will describe jeepneys to me as the backbone of transit in Manila. Some won't. But what else is there? I know there's like some kind of a rail situation, right? And there's buses and such, I imagine.
There's also buses. We do have a lot of them, and those are mostly provincial, so you get to the farther provinces on them. There's also metros, metro rails. We do have them, but unlike in some cities, they're mostly a very well-connected system. This one is there are good connections in some parts, but they still have to make the connections in between the two different rails. So they were built, in different eras almost of the government. So there was a lot of accommodating for existing urban infrastructure.
Whatever the last regime did, the new one kind of wants to work with it, kind of doesn't.
Yes, exactly. So you work with kind of what the last person wanted to do, but then you add your own little twist to it. So there's a lot of different systems kind of happening there. But yeah, people get around.
It works somehow in the end. People get where they need to go. But in your travels, what transit systems or what cities have really impressed you with the ways people get around in them? Doesn't even have to be transit necessarily, but what cities seem to like... You've been around to various cities. What places do people seem to move well through? What cities impress you in that way?
Ooh. Singapore, I guess. It's very organized.
Not surprised to hear they're orderly.
I know, right? What a shocker. Although, I have to say, even though for the organization in Singapore, I still kind of enjoy taking the transit in New York City. I mean, subways... They're just kind of a little adventure that you take every time. And every time I go, it seems that they're expanding or adding a new line. And there's just so much activity in there. I think that's one lesson that maybe Singapore or maybe other places need to learn in terms of activating their public transportation spaces. Like, getting from point A to point B doesn't have to be just about speed and efficiency. It could be about getting to know your neighborhood.
I see. There could be more of an experience of a journey rather than making it as close as possible to teleportation.
Right, exactly. Because in Los Angeles, it's kind of difficult to make things move faster because of the sheer distances between different things. But you might as well, get something out of it, even though you're waiting in the bus, even though you're, waiting at a stop or something. You might as well get to know what's nearby or who's in the neighborhood.
Now, you mentioned that here you do own a car, but it's not a surprise considering we're sitting in the San Fernando Valley now and you live even deeper in the valley. And it's normal here, but it's also... The valley is its own thing. Los Angeles and the valley are not the same. They do get thought of together, but what do you think is the different identity of the valley?
Wow, that's true. Definitely not the same thing. When people think of LA, they definitely think Hollywood, downtown, Silver Lake, Echo Park, but Valley is almost... We're not even the guidebooks, I think. So the thing about the San Fernando Valley, it's very suburban. sometimes you have pockets of farm too. So there are places there that are zoned for having equestrians. Some people still have chickens and orange groves and lemon trees. So in a way, it feels rural. And definitely we have a generous amount of space, which is the reason why a lot of people still tend to take the car around. But having said that, I still hope that a lot of people will consider taking buses and transit, because there's no other way to think of, exploring the city than on transit. Okay, I have to say, in San Fernando Valley, there's a portion too that feels very Caucasian, sure. And there's a portion that feels very Latin American. I've been to the Pacoima area, which is further up north in the valley, and it almost has a feel of East LA because there's a lot of murals there. There's a few young muralists that are actually trying to build like a whole mural mile down there, which is fascinating. There's a lot of young energy there too, but I don't think we tend to see it that much because a lot of eyes are focused on East Los Angeles, right near like the central part of LA.
Putting yourself in a position where you have to write about what's going on in Los Angeles, all over Los Angeles, in terms of its art, its architecture, its design, its built environment. Tell me what kind of perspective does that give you when you're forced to go all around and talk to people you might even not encounter normally? It's not something you get unless you're doing specifically that here in Los Angeles, unless they're doing that kind of journalism.
Right. I love what I do in Los Angeles just because you get to talk to so many different types of people. I think I tend to see both the spectrum of it. So one day I could be attending an event where I have to interview Peter Zumthor for the LACMA proposal. But then on another day I had to interview, a group of young muralists in San Fernando Valley who were basically doing murals for free. And just to see like the whole breadth of experience in Los Angeles is, for me, one of the many reasons why Los Angeles is very endearing to me, because there are many ways that you can live there and experience the city, and that gives you basically the license to do what you want. When you see this whole spectrum, it's like, of course there's going to be a space to do what you want, because obviously these people have prospered, basically making their own gig.
How do you explain the breadth of that spectrum to people not from here when you're explaining Los Angeles? How to get across how wide open the experience of here can be?
I think one of the hardest parts of being in Los Angeles is having people ask you, where do you think I should go in Los Angeles?
Yes, there's an infinitude of answers and thus kind of none.
Yeah, exactly. So you'd have to kind of figure out, like, what type of person are you? But in terms of explaining what Los Angeles is, the best way to really experience this is to, just kind of walk around the city and look at a lot of different things and, be curious about why, for example, the street vendor is in this corner, but also behind him there's this amazingly beautiful, luxurious building.
Where was that? Where do you see a site like that in Los Angeles? That kind of site? Where do you come across that? The vendor in the luxurious building. You see a little of it in Koreatown, but where I live, but where else?
Well, I think the last time I saw it was when I was in downtown Los Angeles. It was probably at night too, when the vendor was trying to sell to like late night clubbers or late night bar hoppers. And I remember thinking, wow, it's so interesting that, this was a guy like behind the Millennium Biltmore and selling hot dogs, and, the kind of life he leads versus the kind of life people in there lead was probably very starkly different.
That kind of a contrast has gotten people to... that kind of a contrast has made people label Los Angeles as some sort of a third world city, as in a sense a third world city over the years. Like, you get the guy on the freeway median selling flowers, but the $50,000 SUV is speeding by him. And I think that if we're using the term third world city, it feels like the images of a place less developed than any of the cities we've been talking about. When you think of third world, what do you think are the qualities of a third world city?
Whoa.
Because I think of what I know about Manila, it's more developed than what I think of when I think of third world city. So that sense of huge contrast, socially, economically, though, seem to still be a part of Manila life.
Yeah, that's still definitely part of being in Manila, and you cannot escape it. When you're in the city, we don't really have, I mean, we do have zoning laws, but we're not really enforcing zoning laws, so you get, like, the luxurious apartments right beside, like, a huge squatter area. Actually, where I live, we have, like, residential areas that are, pretty modest, pretty generous, but right across us is a squatter area. So every morning when I get out of our house, I see it. So you're right there, right beside you. And there's no escaping it. And in a way, that's a reminder that there is still, a huge gap between what is, daily living wage versus, comfortably well off.
There may not be huge squatters' villages here in Los Angeles, but there are still comparable sites. I mean, you still have, like, tent towns on Skid Row, and that's not right next to Beverly Hills, but it's not a world apart in terms of seeing both at once here in Manila, is it?
Yeah. I see a little bit of that in Los Angeles too. When you mentioned Skid Row, I was just there maybe a month ago for a story, and it was in Skid Row, but right, further down south was Arts District, obviously a very, booming kind of area where there's a lot of different developments. And it's so strange to see one thing change from just walking one block to the next block. It's some kind of weird invisible line. And you're wondering, where is that line? Why is nobody crossing that line?
I mentioned you write for magazines like Dwell and Dwell Asia as well. People point to magazines like that as I don't know, evidence of a boom in interest in design, interest in architecture. Do you think that right now there seems to be that boom? There really is more interest, more widespread interest in the built world around us than there has been in recent decades?
I definitely think so. More so, especially in Asia, because I haven't been here long enough in the U.S. to actually see if there was a great interest in built environments. But I think more and more people are seeing design as something that can help them make better cities, better ways of living. And in the sense, there's really more of a push to use design to make better lives. In the Philippines, actually, they just introduced, like, legislation to have, like, a design council in the Philippines, which I think, and I cross my fingers that it's, the start of great things to come, where you're trying to harness the creativity of people in the country and to have it be productive for the country.
It raises an important point because maybe it's better put, not that there's a new interest in design, but that 25 years ago, an American interested in architecture might have had to read Architectural Digest and see these very expensive developments, very expensive homes, just the uppermost layer of the design, the architecture sphere. But now it seems like there's an interest in maybe not smaller scale, maybe not cheap stuff, but still, is it democratization? There's a democratization of interest in architecture and design. Now it seems like people have more of people feel like their interest, not just that they have more of an interest, but that their interest matters more in the world around them. Do you know what I mean? It's not just about mansions now.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think it's partly because lately we've seen a lot of the ground up kind of movements happening. Like, you have places like Etsy or MakerBot or Kickstarter, actually, where you can actually, have a great idea and find people who will help you make that idea come true. The fact that that kind of power is available right now, I think it makes people dream more, figure that they can actually make a difference, or they can actually make that thing that they've been wanting to make.
It's a sense you can build your own environment?
Yeah, definitely.
In a way, it seems like in the Philippines they've had it longer, that sense that they can build their own environment because they've had to. No one else is going to do it.
Yes, they definitely do. I've had the chance to go into one of those squatter areas, and it's very much, self-made. It's a lot of community knowledge in terms of like how to make a good roof, how to make sure that it doesn't leak when it's raining, and how to make sure like there's enough paths in between the alleys to get from one house to another, which admittedly they didn't give a lot of leeway because it was pretty skinny, but I figured they needed more living space. So, and I had talked to a different urban planner in New York City who was also from the Philippines, and we were just talking a little bit about how a lot of knowledge in terms of building your own have actually been there for a long time. We just haven't acknowledged it yet as a kind of design, a form of, making your own environment.
I would imagine urban planners probably have a lesson or two to learn from the people who have built giant squatters' villages. I mean, they wouldn't want to live there necessarily, but there's more thought has gone into it, or more of a process of evolution has gone into these villages, accumulating more knowledge than we would have thought, right?
For sure, definitely. I've often thought about this kind of line between urban planners and people who just kind of make it their own environments. I think as urban planners, people tend to try to plan everything. There's master plans for everything, right? And the green space will go here, the commercial space will go there. But in the sense, the lesson to learn from people who kind of DIY their environment is that you have to have openings for, people to come and make their own environments. That way, they own their neighborhoods. They kind of put their own stamp into it, and that way they're more invested in it. So if there's a way, like a middle ground between super planned and kind of unplanned, that's kind of where you want to be.
Reminds me of, I guess it's an old idea in Southern California terms. Like, if we have all this land, we can sell this place to Americans as where you can have your own house, where you can have your own plot of land, where you can be the true owner. I mean, that's resulted in maybe some neighborhoods that aren't very exciting because they're just houses. But what do you think are the challenges of making places where people have ownership, but also where they're not just a bunch of things people own that you wouldn't want to go to? You know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure. Definitely, in terms of, I think for high-end luxury stuff, it's the trap that they tend to fall into, that everything can be your own. It's for your pleasure only. One of the things that we have to constantly think about is, how you invite your neighborhood or the average person walking on the street to be part of your neighborhood.
What has impressed you here in Los Angeles as far as places that have done not just that, but done well in terms of providing an experience? There's places that surprise you here that just because they exist. A lot of places you didn't know about before, but
there's a lot of places I still don't know about Los Angeles.
What places do you now know that you were brought to, whether by journalism or for other reasons, that did surprise you, that weren't what you expected, or that were most far from your expectations of what they would be?
Wow. It's probably when I started looking around the Arts District area.
This is just east of downtown. We were mentioning it's near Skid Row, but there's a lot more money now in the Arts District than Skid Row certainly has.
Right. Arts District now is definitely different from when I was there, but when I was there, it was still a lot of very artist communities. And the thing with them is, because they're used to, making something better, I think they just apply the same aesthetic to their environment, to their neighborhood. So in the Arts District, there was a guy who basically asked street artists to paint their murals, even though technically it wasn't legal at that point. But in that way, they put a stamp into the neighborhood. They really put a lifeblood into the neighborhood. And now it's kind of a destination for street art, right? So it's that kind of, you do it yourself and you make the change you want to see in your neighborhood kind of aesthetic that's kind of made Arts District the way it is.
It's a good example of two areas you write about converging, art and, shall we call it, urban design, or even architecture. Some of these are on the sides of old buildings. I mean, do you look for where art, architecture, and design come together? Where do those all three come together? Can they all come together in sort of an evenly balanced way?
Ooh, sometimes they come together in an evenly balanced way, I think. Do I look for them specifically where they meet? Not all the time, but I am fascinated when it does happen because it's, I don't know, I think it just kind of shows how even my own path in journalism has kind of expanded into more than just art, into other things, because they're naturally interlaced with each other. Like an urban life probably wouldn't be interesting without a creative, artistic component into it. And even architecture wouldn't be too interesting if it was just like buildings that just stand apart from itself. So I think I see all of those things as part of being in a city that I'd like to live in.
If you had to spend 5 years away from Los Angeles, somewhere, anywhere else, and come back, what would you look at first? What would be the first thing your eye went toward, the first place you went to gauge how things had changed here in that time? Just 5 years, that's all.
I would look at the Los Angeles River, actually.
Straight to the river. Now, to see if it was, fully green, whatever that may mean, or to see what?
I would want to see if people have started to go to the river of their own accord. Because right now, a lot of programs are there to bring people to the river. But once, the Los Angeles River starts to become something that is in the mind of a person from Los Angeles, that's a turning point when they go to the river because they actually heard about it and they want to see it for themselves and to spend time there by themselves. One of the things also with being on the river is that there can be a totally different experience of it. There are parts of it that are very much like, a natural river.
Like a river.
Exactly. But there are parts of it that are very much like the concrete walled river that we know and love so well in movies. But people find beauty in that. I had talked to a writer, Jenny Price, who talks a lot about ecology and the environment. And one of her favorite spots on the river is this concrete wall high up, kind of near Dominguez wetlands. But it's that part where you're so high up and you can see both the concrete area and a wetland area that they made. Just having that contrast, I think, is kind of interesting to be in between, physically in between.
We seem to all agree on the relationship. We seem to all agree on the role of the Pacific Ocean here, but other forms of water, the river or the rain coming down above us right now, Los Angeles has a very confused relationship with it, seems like, doesn't it?
Yeah. Okay. I think it's still in the midst of changing, and I'm sure it'll be much, much better. But Los Angeles historically has kind of thought of water as something that they should get rid of as quickly as possible because of flooding and because we're not used to it, maybe. So the concrete wall was designed to filter water and flush it out to the Pacific Ocean as fast as possible. But right now, because of climate change, of a lot of different things that are happening, Los Angeles needs to also learn to use water as a resource. Instead of trying to flush it all as quickly as possible, you want to try to reuse it, make sure that it goes into infiltration basins and gets reused. The fact that we're 2/3 of LA's water is from everywhere else but LA is kind of concerning, especially when all those other sources are kind of drying up in their own way.
Especially true of the valley right here. It gets its water from a fairly distant source, right?
Exactly. It comes from basically Colorado River, the San Francisco Bay Delta area. They're pretty far away. Owens Valley, most famously. So I think we need to figure out that water isn't just there for our convenience. We just have to, treat it as a resource as well. And basically recycling it. Reuse, reduce, recycle. The same thing for water.
Let's say the same 5 years away question for Manila. What do you look at there to see what's gone on in the time you've been away? Haven't seen it at all.
For there, I would totally love to see transit. I would want to see... We do get around with jeepneys, taxis, and buses, but we definitely need to answer the question of how do people get to where they're going to faster and more efficiently. There are systems in place, but they're not all integrated. I'd love to see kind of jeepneys that are integrated with the metro system, that are integrated with like the biking system. They're all their own entities right now, and for them to kind of all be part of the same system would be amazing.
Do you think the Philippines has ever been or is becoming good at adapting ideas from elsewhere, looking at other places, other cities, other countries, and saying, we could do something with that? What does it take for that process to happen in the Philippines, do you think?
I think the Philippines has been used to borrowing ideas from different countries. The question, though, I feel, is not just borrowing the idea wholesale, not piecemeal, wholesale, but really looking at how the idea works within the current system that they have. We're very good at importing an idea. Actually, a lot of things are imported in terms of what things are valuable, like furniture and a lot of things. But we have to kind of see how that makes sense in the whole context of what the Philippines is at the moment. So I think that's a challenge. To make that happen, I think it's starting. We have a younger group of artists, of architects who are more progressive, who are starting to kind of see their neighborhood as a resource, as something to explore and be excited about.
Did they study abroad generally or in the Philippines?
You know what? Both of them, yeah. All of them actually studied in the Philippines. But I think because you get a lot more information online through friends, it's a very network world right now. A lot of ideas actually get filtered to the Philippines, and it gets translated to these people who are real locals, who understand what the context is. And that's pretty exciting for me.
Writing about both Los Angeles and Asia, or the West and Asia, what do you think Los Angeles could learn from Asia as far as the way it's changing itself, building itself, revising itself? What do you think is done perhaps better in Asia or more suitably in Asia that could be learned from here?
We were talking a little bit about this. I think Asia has a very big hospitality attitude, very centered on being part of a community. In the U.S., there's a lot of individualism, which is great. I mean, that's a wonderful thing about the U.S. But there's this accommodation in Asia for other people. So when it comes to design or even building multifamily housing, when we look at how shared spaces could work, I think you could learn a lot from, looking into places like Asia.
What are the times in America where you think, man, I wish this country had a little bit more of that hospitality? What do you come up against here? What sort of settings that remind you that this country still has something to learn from that hospitality?
Well, I tend to go to community meetings a lot and maybe city council meetings when they discuss plans. So whenever there's a person who says, I don't want this, I think there was a parking thing that they were discussing.
Common type of thing to be discussed in Los Angeles is a parking thing.
Yeah, exactly. Oh man, that was a couple of years ago. But I was surprised at the vehemence that some of the neighborhood councils had shown in terms of, I don't want more transit-oriented developments here because that means less parking, and in my neighborhood that means more congestion. But then I listen to them and I figure out they don't seem to want to change their ways, but I think in Asia you would see more of a respect in terms of the greater good. Not to knock, the U.S. down. And I think there's definitely a negotiation there between individualism and being part of a community. So I think that time, definitely with parking, multifamily housing, when you look at just the amount of thought that there is to your neighbor, like when you have common walls in houses and you hear like the loud knocking or whatever, there's already an instinctive kind of custom for people in Asia to think about their neighbor, to think about how that affects the other person. But here it's mostly, it's my four walls. I have the right to do what I want within my four walls.
And many of my friends, most of whom are pretty pro-transit, will make fun of, say, Beverly Hills. Say, they don't want the subway to come through because they don't want any brown people coming into their neighborhood. They don't. But then you look at another side of that, and I think people talk about certain small neighborhoods in Los Angeles that evolved kind of by themselves and evolved character, like a Limerick Park, say, for example, in South Los Angeles. And people will sometimes write about how, if transit comes here, will the neighborhood get diluted? Will its character go away? Will things become expensive? I mean, there's a sort of, I don't know if they're two sides of one coin there, but like, we can make fun of the Beverly Hills people, but I suppose there are legitimate questions about, like, well, how did these neighborhoods get to be this way? Is it because they were isolated? Do you know what I mean?
I'm kind of lost there.
Yeah, it's a tough thing to explain, because in Los Angeles, you think about the neighborhoods and, like, how did they evolve? Some of them seem to have evolved the way they are because they're so far from other neighborhoods, because they're kind of hard to get to, one to the other, and in a sense, it's the thing I hate most about Los Angeles, is the way that things are hard to get to, one to another. But then you can also flip it over and say maybe that isolation, in a sense, made this a kind of microcosm of the world, made all these cultures still accessible and not fully assimilated into one another. And that is part of the experience here, too. How do you think about that situation?
Well, in Los Angeles, there's definitely a lot of different neighborhoods with a lot of different feels to it. And you're right. I guess when you make transit accessible in those different places, there is a constant worry of how will the neighborhood change, because suddenly people can find us now.
It's the same with freeways, I guess, when those were getting built, and Beverly Hills didn't want that either.
Yeah, who would want freeways, right? I think, though, maybe if you look at it, there's going to be a side of, yes, there's definitely going to be changes. There's definitely a lot of, development that's going to happen because of transit that's going to come in through like a certain neighborhood. But then it's also up to the neighborhood to kind of express who they are and to really show these people that this is what's great about this neighborhood. So I think it's kind of a challenge to neighborhoods to keep their integrity in a way.
How much of what you're writing about, when you're writing about the people who are doing architecture, design, art, how much of it is about seeing how they're responding to a challenge for you?
I think it always starts there, because one of the first questions I always ask is, what made you decide to do this? Or if it was for an architecture firm, what was the biggest challenge of kind of creating this project that you're doing? So it always kind of has to start from what was the initial state, and then why does this design kind of meet what were the needs of that community? And from there, I guess that's where I judge the merits.
You see the challenge first, you get the challenge laid out, but then you have to explore. You can't really get at the nature of the project, the innovation, and the piece of art unless you get into the personality of the creator, can you?
That's true. There's a lot of personality that comes into a specific design, and that's where the creative expression comes from. But then that's also the beauty of like a lot of projects, because they specifically answer a challenge, but then there's also specifically that person's take into the solution to the problem that makes it a form of art.
Who's someone who has solved a problem in a fascinating way you've talked to recently? Who'd be a good example of someone here or someone in Asia? Is it all a community of creators? Is there a difference between the people doing that here, doing it in Asia?
In Asia, I would say you would get a little bit less of like the big luxurious projects. more into like the grassroots activist kind of projects. So I think that's pretty fascinating. One of the ones that I'm recently enamored with is in the Philippines, there's a graphic arts collective. And you and I had talked about how difficult it is sometimes to get to know different neighborhoods, especially in Manila, because it's convoluted, it's confusing, and it's not user-friendly. So they actually made really beautiful illustrated guides to their neighborhoods. And because they're graphic designers, I think people are just naturally drawn to picking it up. It's colorful, it's creative, and it's also informative. So they're called wander.ph, and what they did is tie up with different restaurants and have that be available in the restaurants for free. In a way, that's kind of activist for me, but I love that they incorporated the neighborhood, that they incorporated design and art into what they were doing, and I'm really excited, and hopefully they keep on doing it. I don't know yet about how they're doing the funding part, which is always a question too, but I love that somebody has started to do something like that.
You mentioned to me in the Philippines, it's best to have a local with you, showing you around, giving you a link to the social knowledge you need, and that sounds like that project is a way of putting the social knowledge into the form of a pamphlet you can hold on to. I mean, it's making knowledge the community has accessible, just accessible, is it not?
Yeah, very much so. Because one doesn't always have friends in the Philippines. And I mean, there are people who do love to explore and get lost by themselves. But having something like that makes it a little less intimidating.
It seems like it's harder to get social knowledge here, or it's less clustered. There's less of a center of as we've been saying, social community knowledge to tap into in Los Angeles. You kind of have to go all over the place, whether intellectually or literally all over the place, don't you?
Yeah, very, very much so. So one of the things that was the biggest challenge for me moving to LA was because I didn't know anybody, as in probably, nobody. So I just ended up, kind of focusing on a specific neighborhood, maybe trying to reach out to a specific person and talking about their experience. But it's only through the years that I've gotten to know more people, and suddenly connections are happening.
Right. You focus on very, very small parts. Eventually the picture forms, but it does take a while, doesn't it? I've had the same experience.
There you go. Exactly. But in the Philippines, usually you can just ask like one or two people and they would all be very well connected because the network has been there probably for generations.
In Manila, so you know somebody, they know a bunch of people, they each know a bunch of people. You kind of know everybody. If you had know one person here, you could know one person and they could know nobody and you're in a dead end.
Right, exactly. But in a way, that's a good thing. My husband and I often say the good thing about being in Los Angeles is that you could do your thing, but, it won't be something that other people talk about behind your back. In the Philippines, word travels fast, I guess. It doesn't, because psychologically everybody's so well connected, there's also almost less room to move. It depends. Or you could see it as there's a better way to, to share your ideas because everyone's so well connected. It's
a double-edged sword. Every place is one, right?
Yeah, there's always like a double-edged sword. So.
Finally, what city is fascinating you right now that you really just want to get to and see what's actually going on? What city you've never been to, do you just need to set foot in now to know what is going on there? Innovations, whether art, design, architecture, anything. What's drawing your attention distantly, from afar?
There's so many, honestly.
Name just one. Don't worry about the most. What's one of them?
I still really do want to explore China, but not like Shanghai or Beijing. I want to explore those areas that are being changed by the sheer breakneck speed of change in China. I have a friend who grew up in the Xinjiang province. It's like further north in China, and I believe it's closer to like Russia. But it's really one of those border areas that you would think would be forgotten by development and change. But from the way he talks about it, it seems that even there, like, life has changed so much. There's not the street hawker, selling food on the streets anymore.
The new era has come in fast.
And I want to see that. Like, how does this new era happen in such a breakneck speed? And how do the people kind of cope with that change? Because that's still basically one generation. From when my friend was young to now he's around 30-something. That's one lifetime.
Completely different than Los Angeles has developed, or Manila. As far as I know, I mean, there's been some quick development there, but nothing like China, right?
Yeah. I am impressed with Chinese people in the sense that they do, when they say they're going to do something, they can definitely do something in the sense that, very top down, everyone's going to be falling in line. So in that way, it's very impressive.
I've been speaking here in North Hollywood with Carren Jao. She is the author of many pieces on art, architecture, and design for Dwell Asia, Surface Asia, the Los Angeles Times, KCET, the Architects newspaper, Makeshift, and more. Carren, thanks so much.
Thank you.
This has been Notebook on Cities and Culture. I've been Colin Marshall. You can keep up with the cultural creators, internationalists, and observers of the urban scene on the show at colinmarshall.org. Thanks. Special thanks to everyone who backed Season 4 on Kickstarter, including Joel Neville Anderson, Daniel Levin Becker, Paige Calvert, Commander Manvark, Jonathan Crow, John Cunningham, David Dawes, James DeVito, Tim Dobbs, Paul Doyle, Jake Elliott, Kevin Emmett, Lawrence English, Jonathan Filbert, Andrew Philippone Jr., Michael Fransky, John French, Themis Douglas Eucrucius, Will Graham, Umberto Grant, Samuel Hansen, David Hayes, Jeff Hillenbrand, Mark Hines, Andrew Johnstone, Tadeusz Andrzej Kodlubowski, Peter Kavanaugh, Ted Kane, Andy Cooney, Evan Landman, Alfred Lee, James Maloney, Sean McDonald, Alberto Bruzos Moro, Jason Miller, Rob Montz, Daniel Murphy, Richard Nash, Aidan Nullman, Patrick O'Flaherty, Danny Olson, Michael O'Regan, Ian Blosker, Christopher Porter, MJ Pritchett, Piers Rippey, Rob Schultz, Todd Shimoda, Cam Smith, Deborah Smith, Adam Sutherland, Maureen Kincaid Speller, Anna Traher, Thomas Unterberger, Matt Warren, Nick Weigelt, Dion Wolf, Cynthia Yang, and Wayne Wright.